I sent one photo to our family group chat. My daughter Grace was pale in her hospital bed, 3 days after the surgery that had almost taken her life. Her wrist still carried the plastic hospital bracelet, and her small hand held the stuffed rabbit she had brought from home. "She wants to see you," I wrote. My brother Derek replied, "Busy. Handle it." Then my mother added, "She lived. Stop making her our problem." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I typed, "It's okay." Put the phone face down beside Grace's bed and turned away so my little girl would not see me cry. At 10 p.m. that night, what my family saw on the evening news made them drop their phones. Stay with me, because that night did not just expose a few cruel messages. It exposed the lie my family had been living behind for years. If you believe quiet people eventually deserve justice, please subscribe and follow this story to the end. My name is Hannah Reed. I was 34 years old, a widow, and the only parent Grace had left. Her father, Daniel, died in a work accident when she was 3. Since then, every fever, every school form, every bill, and every hard decision had landed on me. I was used to doing things alone, but I had never wanted Grace to feel alone with me. That week, I had signed more hospital papers than I could count. The doctors had explained the risks in calm voices, but all I heard was the fear underneath their careful words. The surgery was necessary. The surgery was dangerous. The surgery might save my child, but it might also take her from me. For 2 days after the operation, Grace stayed in the ICU. She slept more than she woke. When she did open her eyes, she only had enough strength to squeeze my fingers. I sat beside her through every beep of the machines and every quiet visit from the nurses, whispering the same words again and again. "I'm here, baby. Mommy's right here." On the 3rd day, Grace was moved to a recovery room. She was still weak, but the doctors said she was stable. That should have been enough to make me breathe again. Instead, I sat beside her bed with a different kind of ache in my chest, because Grace kept looking at the door. "Is Grandma coming?" she asked. I smoothed the blanket over her legs and tried to smile. "I can ask. And Uncle Derek?" The hope in her voice hurt more than any accusation could have. Grace did not know that my mother, Marjorie, had only sent one text since the surgery began. "Keep us updated." She did not know Derek had responded to my earlier updates with a thumbs-up emoji and nothing else. She was 7. She still believed adults came when children needed them. "Tell them I'm not scary anymore," Grace whispered. I swallowed hard. She thought the tubes and machines had kept them away. She did not understand that some people could stand in front of cameras talking about compassion and still ignore a child in their own family. I opened the group chat. The last real conversation there had been about Derek's upcoming Children's Hope Gala. My mother had written, "So proud of my son." Derek had been chosen as one of the evening's featured donors, and Marjorie had spent weeks telling everyone he was helping sick children. The irony did not fully hit me until I looked from that message to my daughter's thin face on the pillow. I took the photo carefully. I did not want to make Grace look pitiful. I only wanted them to see her. Alive, fragile, waiting. "She wants to see you," I wrote. Derek answered first. "Busy. Handle it." I waited for my mother to correct him. I waited for her to say that Grace was his niece, that he should be ashamed, that someone would come by after the event. A foolish part of me still believed there had to be a line even my family would not cross. Then my mother's message appeared. "She lived. Stop making her our problem." For a moment, I could not move. Grace was breathing softly beside me, half awake, still waiting for good news. I typed the only lie I had ever been trained to type. "It's okay." But it was not okay. It had never been okay. Not when my parents called me dramatic for needing help after Daniel died. Not when they said single motherhood was my choice. Not when relatives sent money months earlier because Marjorie told them Grace needed medical support, and somehow that money never reached the hospital. I had explained away too much. I had swallowed too much. But seeing those words beside my daughter's hospital bed made something inside me go still. I turned toward the window and cried silently. I pressed my hand over my mouth so Grace would not hear. A nurse named Claire stepped in a few minutes later with Grace's medication. She saw my face, then saw the empty visitor chair beside the bed. She did not ask too much. She only checked Grace's vitals, adjusted the blanket, and spoke to my daughter in a gentle voice. "How's our brave girl feeling?" Grace opened her eyes. "My grandma might come." Claire looked at me for half a second. In that tiny pause, she understood more than my family had understood all week. "She would be lucky to see you," Claire said. Grace smiled faintly and drifted back to sleep. Around 6 that evening, I heard movement outside the room. Hospital staff were guiding a small news crew down the hall. The hospital had mentioned that Channel 8 was filming a segment about children recovering after major surgeries tied to the Children's Hope Gala that night. I had barely listened earlier. My world had been reduced to Grace's breathing, her pain levels, and the next time the doctor would come in, then a woman stopped at our door. I recognized her from local news. "Maya Collins." She knocked softly. "Mrs. Reed?" "Hannah is fine," I said. She gave a respectful nod. "Hannah, we're filming a short piece tonight about the gala and the children this hospital has helped. Your nurse said Grace has been through a difficult surgery. We would only film with your permission, and only if you're comfortable." I almost said no. I had spent my life protecting my family from consequences. Even after the message my mother had sent, some tired part of me still wanted privacy, quiet, and no more trouble. Then Grace stirred. Her eyes moved to the microphone in Maya's hand. "Is that TV?" she whispered. Maya smiled. "Only if your mom says it's okay." Grace looked at me. "Maybe Grandma will see." That sentence settled heavily between us. She did not want attention. She did not want sympathy. She wanted the people who had ignored her to remember she existed. I sat beside her and took her hand. "Do you want to say something?" Grace nodded weakly. I looked at Maya. "You can film, but let her speak for herself." The camera light came on. Maya kept her voice soft and asked Grace what she wanted most, now that the hardest part was over. Grace looked toward the empty chair beside her bed. "I just wanted Grandma to come," she whispered. No one spoke for a moment. From the television down the hallway, I heard Derek's voice in the gala broadcast, smooth and proud, saying, "No child should ever feel alone after surgery." I looked at my daughter's hospital bracelet, then at my phone, where my family's messages were still waiting beneath the dark screen. By 10 o'clock that night, the whole city would see the truth. And for the first time in my life, I was not going to protect my family from what they had chosen to be. After Maya and the camera crew stepped out, the room felt too quiet. Grace had fallen asleep again, her small face turned toward the empty visitor chair, as if someone might still walk through the door. I kept my hand over hers and listened to the soft rhythm of the machines. The camera had captured only a few minutes of our lives, but those few minutes carried years of things I had never said out loud. People like my mother do not become cruel all at once. They teach you slowly. A missed recital here, a forgotten promise there, a look across the dinner table that says your pain is inconvenient. By the time you are grown, you have learned to lower your voice before anyone asks you to. You learn to explain away neglect because calling it what it is would mean admitting how little you were protected. Derek was 4 years older than me, and in our house, that somehow made him both the first child and the only child who mattered. When he got a B in math, my mother said he was under pressure because he had leadership qualities. When I came home with straight A's, she told me not to brag. When Derek quit baseball after my parents had spent thousands on equipment and travel teams, my father called it finding himself. When I needed money for college application fees, my mother asked why I could not choose cheaper dreams. I used to think I was jealous. That was what Marjorie told me whenever I pointed out the difference. She said I kept score because I had a bitter heart, so I stopped pointing things out. I became useful instead. I remembered birthdays. I cleaned up after family dinners. I answered calls when my mother needed someone to listen to her complain. I showed up for Derek's milestones, even when he forgot mine. I told myself that being easy to love might eventually make them love me better. Then Grace was born, and for a short while, I believed she might soften them. Daniel held her like she was made of glass and sunlight. He used to say she had my eyes and his stubborn little chin. My parents came to the hospital with flowers, took pictures, and called themselves proud grandparents. For a few weeks, I let myself believe we had turned a corner, but when Daniel died in that work accident 4 years later, the corner disappeared. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of me, death certificates, insurance forms, bills I did not understand, and Grace asleep on the couch after crying for her father until her voice went hoarse. My mother came over for 1 hour. She folded 2 towels, looked around the messy house, and said, "You'll have to be strong now. You have a child." As if I had not known that already. As if strength was something people say when they do not want to help. Derek sent a sympathy card with his assistant's handwriting on the envelope. My father called once and told me to make sure I did not let grief affect my job. After the funeral, people stopped asking how I was. They asked if I had gone back to work. They asked if Grace was sleeping through the night. They asked practical things, because practical questions did not require them to sit with my pain. So I built a life where I did not need them. At least, that was what I told myself. I worked long hours, stretched every dollar, and learned the language of medical bills after Grace began getting sick more often. Her condition did not look dramatic at first. Fatigue, pain that came and went, doctors who said we should monitor it, tests, referrals, more tests. Then finally, a diagnosis that made the room tilt under my feet. When surgery became the only option, I called my mother before I called anyone else. I still hate admitting that. Even after everything, fear made me reach for the person a daughter is supposed to be able to reach for. Marjorie sounded concerned at first. She asked the right questions. What hospital? What date? What did the doctor say? Then she said she would spread the word quietly, because family should help family. A week later, my Aunt Susan called and said she had sent money to my mother for Grace. A cousin mentioned the same thing. A friend of my father said his church group had contributed. I asked my mother about it once, and she said the money was being collected carefully, so it would not create tax confusion. I was too exhausted to argue. I wanted to believe her because disbelief would have required energy I did not have. The hospital bills kept coming anyway. That was why her message hurt in a place deeper than anger. She lived. Stop making her our problem. It was not just cruel, it was a confession. Grace had never been a granddaughter to Marjorie when love required sacrifice. She had only been a story to tell when it made the family look generous. Grace moved in her sleep and made a small sound. I leaned closer at once. "Mommy," she whispered. "I'm here." Did Grandma answer? I looked at her face, so pale against the pillow, and felt the truth pressing against my teeth. I could not tell her what my mother had written. Not then. Not while her body was still fighting to heal. "She knows," I said carefully. Grace watched me with tired eyes. "Is she mad because I got sick?" My heart twisted so sharply I almost gasped. "No, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong. Then why doesn't she come?" There are questions children ask that adults should be ashamed to create. I brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead and kissed the place where the hospital tape had left a faint mark near her temple. "Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices," I said. "That does not mean you are not loved." "By you," she whispered. "Yes, always by me." She closed her eyes again, but her words stayed in the room. "By you. Not by us. Not by them. By you." A little before 8, Claire returned and told me Grace's evening numbers looked steady. She smiled when she said it, and I clung to that smile like it was a rope. Stable, breathing well, responding. Every simple medical phrase felt like a miracle after the terror of the ICU. From the hallway, I heard a television playing louder than before. A nurse had turned it on at the station, and the early coverage of the Children's Hope Gala filled the corridor. I could hear applause, then a host's cheerful voice thanking donors for helping children and families in crisis. Families in crisis. I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. When I stepped into the doorway, Derek was on the screen. He looked polished and expensive in a dark suit, standing beneath warm stage lights beside a banner with gold lettering, Children's Hope Gala. Behind him, donors smiled over white tablecloths and flower arrangements. My mother stood near the front, wearing pearls, and the proud expression she saved only for Derek. A reporter asked him why the cause mattered so much. Derek placed one hand over his heart. "No child should ever feel alone after surgery," he said, "and no parent should have to face a hospital room without support." For a second, I thought I might be sick. Behind me, Grace slept in a room with one empty visitor chair. My phone still held his message. "Busy. Handle it." My mother's words sat beneath it like a slap. She lived. Stop making her our problem. Claire came to stand beside me, close enough that I knew she had heard him too. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Maya appeared at the end of the hallway with her cameraman, reviewing footage on a small monitor. She glanced from the television to me, then to the room where Grace was sleeping. Her expression changed, not into excitement, but into recognition. She had seen the shape of the story now. Not a scandal yet. Not revenge. Just two truths standing side by side, one under gala lights, one under hospital fluorescence. I went back to Grace's bedside and picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the group chat. I could have deleted the messages. I could have hidden them like I had hidden so many things before. I could have told myself that privacy mattered more than truth, that family shame would only make Grace's recovery harder, that silence was safer. Then Grace opened her eyes again and looked toward the door. "Did they forget me again?" she asked. Again. That one word decided for me. Not because I wanted to destroy Derek, not because I wanted my mother humiliated, but because my daughter had already learned the pattern, and she was only 7 years old. When Maya returned to ask if I was comfortable with the interview airing later that night, I looked at my phone, then at the empty chair beside my daughter's bed. "Yes," I said quietly, "and there's something else you need to see." I unlocked my phone and showed Maya the group chat. She read my message first, then Derek's reply, then my mother's words. Her face did not change much, but her silence told me she understood exactly what she was seeing. "She wants to see you. Busy. Handle it." She lived. Stop making her our problem. Maya looked toward Grace's bed. My daughter was asleep again, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, her face still pale from surgery. "Hannah," Maya said softly, "I need to be clear. If you allow us to use these messages, people may figure out who your family is. We can blur names, but the meaning will still be obvious." I looked at the empty visitor chair beside Grace's bed. It had been there all day, untouched. "They wrote those words because they thought no one would ever see them," I said. "I want people to see." Maya nodded. She did not rush me. She gave me a release form that explained exactly what could be used. No private medical records, no full names without permission, no hidden footage. Only Grace's short interview, the image of the empty chair, and the messages I had agreed to share. I read every line before signing. I was tired, but I was not careless. For once, I wanted the truth handled cleanly. From the hallway, the television near the nurse's station grew louder. The early gala coverage had started. I heard applause, then a familiar voice. Derek's voice. I stepped into the doorway. There he was on the screen, standing under warm lights in a dark suit, smiling like the kind of man people trusted. Behind him was a gold banner for the Children's Hope Gala. My mother stood near the front, wearing pearls and the proud expression she only ever wore for him. A reporter asked why the cause mattered to him. Derek placed a hand over his heart and said, "No child should ever feel alone after surgery." For a moment, the hallway seemed to tilt. Less than 2 hours earlier, he had told me to handle Grace myself. My mother had called my daughter our problem, and now they were on television, accepting applause for caring about children like mine. Maya stood beside me. She looked at the screen, then back at Grace's room. She did not need me to explain. The lie was right there, glowing under gala lights. My phone buzzed. I thought, foolishly, that maybe my mother had changed her mind. But the message was from my father. "Your mother says you're upset. Tonight is important for Derek. Please don't make things harder." I stared at it for a long second. My father had always been quiet, and I used to mistake that for kindness. But silence beside cruelty is not kindness. It is permission. Maya glanced at my phone. "Do you want that included too?" "No," I said. "Not tonight. I want people to see what happened to Grace. I do not want this to become every wound I have ever carried." She accepted that without argument. Inside the room, Grace stirred. I went back to her side and took her hand. "Mommy," she whispered, "did I do okay on TV?" I bent closer. "You did very well. Will Grandma see?" I could not promise that. But I could tell her something true. "Maybe," I said. "But what matters is that you told the truth." Grace's eyes moved toward the empty chair. I did not say anything bad. "No, baby, you didn't. I just wanted her." I swallowed hard and kissed her forehead. "I know." At 8:30, Maya returned to confirm the segment would air at 10. She said it would begin with Derek's public comments at the gala, then shift to Grace's room. The messages would appear after Grace's interview. Names would be blurred, but the words would not be changed. "Your family will probably call after it airs," Maya said. "I know. They may say you embarrassed them." I looked at Grace's small hand inside mine. They embarrassed themselves. I only stopped hiding it. After Maya left, I checked the group chat again. No one had asked whether Grace was in pain. No one had asked if I had eaten, slept, or needed help. My mother had sent one more message. "I hope you're not still sulking. Derek has a very important night." I almost replied. I almost wrote that Grace had an important night too. She had survived. She had woken up. She had asked for them. But I did not send anything. For once, I let their own words remain unanswered. At 9:55, I turned on the television in Grace's room and lowered the volume. Grace was asleep, and I did not want to wake her. The news began with weather, then traffic, then the gala. The ballroom appeared first. White flowers, gold lights, donors clapping, Derek at the podium, calm and polished. "No child should ever feel alone after surgery," he said again. Then the screen changed. There was Grace, small in her hospital bed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted Grandma to come." The reporter's voice continued over footage of my hand holding hers. She said that while donors across town spoke about supporting children in recovery, one mother had received a very different response from her own family after asking them to visit her daughter. Then the messages appeared. "She wants to see you. Busy, handle it. She lived. Stop making her our problem." I did not see my family's faces in that moment. I was not at the gala, and I would not pretend I was. I only saw the truth on the screen. Their truth, my daughter's truth. The truth I had spent years being too ashamed to say out loud. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Maya. She sent a short video someone at the gala had recorded. In it, Derek stood frozen under the ballroom lights, while people around him stared at their phones. My mother watched the screen with one hand over her mouth. Then her phone slipped from her fingers and hit the floor. For the first time in my life, they were not controlling the story. They were trapped inside it. My phone did not stop buzzing after Maya sent that video. At first, I thought it was my family. Then I saw names I had not seen in months. Aunt Susan, Cousin Rachel, one of my father's church friends, a neighbor from the street where I grew up, people who had watched the 10 o'clock news and suddenly understood that the perfect Reed family had a crack running straight through it. Most messages were short, but they hit hard. Is that Grace? Did Derek really say that? Your mother told us the family was helping with everything. That last one made my hand go cold. I had known, somewhere deep down, that Marjorie had used Grace's illness to gather sympathy. I had suspected money had been mentioned, but seeing people write it back to me made the suspicion feel heavier. My mother had not only ignored my daughter, she had been telling people she was helping us. Grace slept through most of it. I kept the television off after the segment ended. She did not need to hear grown adults panic because their private cruelty had become public. She needed sleep, medicine, and peace. I silenced my phone and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. For about 20 minutes, the room was calm again. Claire checked Grace's vitals and told me her oxygen level looked good. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I kept looking toward the door, waiting for the people who had ignored us all day to arrive now that strangers were watching. They came at 11:12. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock when I heard my mother's voice in the hallway. Not soft, not frightened. Sharp and controlled, the voice she used when a restaurant lost her reservation. We are her family. You cannot keep us from seeing her. Claire stepped into the doorway before they could enter. Grace is asleep. You need to keep your voices down. My mother appeared behind her with a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in plastic. Derek stood beside her, still wearing his gala suit, his face pale under the hallway lights. My father, Arthur, lingered a few steps behind them, hands in his coat pockets, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Marjorie saw me and lifted the flowers as if they were proof of love. Hannah, this has gone far enough, she said. Not, how is Grace? Not, I am sorry. Not, we should have come sooner. This has gone far enough. I stood slowly, careful not to wake my daughter. Lower your voice. Derek stepped forward. Do you understand what you did tonight? I looked at his suit, his loosened tie, the small donor pin still attached to his lapel. Yes. No, you do not, he said. My phone is exploding. Board members are calling. Sponsors are asking questions. Do you know what that clip makes me look like? I stared at him. Like a man who told his sister to handle her sick child alone. His jaw tightened. That message was taken out of context. I almost laughed, but Grace shifted in her sleep, and the sound pulled me back into myself. I lowered my voice. What was the context, Derek? She wanted to see you. You said you were busy. Mom said she was not the family's problem. Which part needs explaining? Marjorie pushed past Claire just enough to enter the room. She placed the lilies on the counter, though no one had asked her to bring flowers. I was upset. I worded it badly. You know I did not mean it that way. You meant it enough to send it. My mother's face flushed. You have always been eager to make me the villain. There it was. The old move. Turn the pain into my personality. Make my wound sound like an accusation invented for attention. Before I could answer, Grace opened her eyes. For 1 second, the room changed. Marjorie's expression softened, but not naturally. It was the soft look she put on for photographs. She moved toward the bed with the bouquet rustling in her hands. Sweetheart, she said. Grandma is here. Grace looked at her, then at Derek, then at me. Her voice was small and rough from sleep. Did you come because of me? Or because of the news? No one moved. The question was too honest for the room. Derek looked down. My father closed his eyes briefly. My mother held the flowers in front of her like a shield. Of course we came because of you, Marjorie said. Grace watched her with the tired seriousness of a child who had already learned too much. I waited all day. My mother's smile trembled. Grandma had an important event. Grace looked at Derek. For sick kids? Derek's face went red. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I stepped closer to the bed and touched Grace's shoulder. You do not have to talk, baby. She nodded and closed her eyes again, but her little hand found mine under the blanket. Derek looked toward the hallway, where two nurses were pretending not to listen. This is exactly what I mean. Now everyone thinks we abandoned a child. You need to make a statement tomorrow. Tell Maya you were emotional. Tell her we have always supported you. Claire's expression hardened, but she stayed professional. My father finally spoke from the doorway. Derek, not here. Derek turned on him. Then where, Dad? Because if this spreads, I lose the hospital board. I might lose the fundraiser account. Do you know how many people saw that? I said, that is what you are worried about? He looked back at me. You made a private family matter public. No, I said. You made a child's pain inconvenient. I made it visible. My mother set the flowers down too hard. That is enough. You are angry, and you are punishing us. But when people ask, you will tell them this family has been helping you. I felt the old fear rise in me, the fear of being called dramatic, ungrateful, bitter, the fear of standing alone against three people who could rewrite any room if I let them talk long enough. Then Dr. Hart entered. He had changed out of his surgical cap, but his eyes still carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent too many hours fighting for other people's children. He looked from me to my family, then to Grace. Is everything all right in here? Marjorie turned instantly warm. Doctor, thank goodness, we are Grace's family. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. We have been very involved, of course. Dr. Hart looked at me first, not her. Hannah? That one small choice steadied me. I said, they came after the news aired. They want me to say they have been supporting us. Dr. Hart's face did not change, but his voice became colder. I see. Derek tried to smile. Doctor, with respect, this is family tension. The media twisted something private. Dr. Hart looked at him. I cannot speak to your family messages. I can speak to what I have observed. Hannah has been the only person present through Grace's surgery, ICU stay, and recovery transfer. She signed the consent forms. She sat through the risk briefings. She was here when Grace woke up. Until tonight, I had not seen any of you. The room went silent. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Derek looked as if someone had taken his script away. My father lowered his eyes. Dr. Hart continued, Grace needs rest. Stress is not helpful to her recovery. If your presence creates distress, visiting can be limited. Marjorie turned to me, eyes sharp now. You would keep us from our granddaughter. I looked at Grace's sleeping face. The answer came easier than I expected. I will keep anything from her that hurts her. My mother recoiled as if I had slapped her. Derek shook his head and muttered, Unbelievable. But I was done trying to be believable to people committed to misunderstanding me. Claire stepped forward. I think Grace needs quiet now. For a moment, I thought Marjorie would refuse to leave. Then she remembered the nurses, the doctor, the hallway, the possibility of more witnesses. She picked up her purse with stiff hands. This family is not finished discussing this, she said. No, I replied. But tonight, you are finished discussing it in my daughter's room. Derek walked out first. My father followed slowly. At the doorway, he looked back at Grace, and for a second, I saw something like shame on his face. It was not enough. Shame without action had been the Reed family language for years. My mother was the last to leave. She glanced at the flowers on the counter. I brought those for her. I looked at the white lilies, beautiful and useless. Take them with you, I said. She cannot breathe around strong flowers right now. That was not entirely true. The nurses could have moved them, but I did not want one more symbol of my mother's performance in that room. When the door finally closed, The silence felt different, not empty, protected. Claire exhaled softly. Are you okay? I sat beside Grace again and held her hand. Not yet. Dr. Hart nodded. That is an honest answer. A few minutes later, Grace opened her eyes just enough to whisper, Did they go? Yes, baby. Are you mad? I kissed her fingers. Not at you, never at you. She thought for a moment. I do not want grandma flowers. I smiled through the ache in my chest. Then no grandma flowers. Grace closed her eyes again. My phone buzzed inside the drawer, again and again, but I did not reach for it. For the first time, their panic could wait. My daughter could not, and as I sat in that quiet room, I understood something I should have understood years earlier. The people who only show up after being exposed are not coming to love you. They are coming to manage the damage. By morning, the story had spread farther than I expected. I woke in the chair beside Grace's bed with a stiff neck, a cold coffee on the table, and 43 unread messages on my phone. Some were from people I barely knew. Some were from relatives who had been quiet for months. A few were from neighbors who said they had seen Grace on the news and wanted to help. I did not answer at first. Grace was still asleep, and the doctor had said rest mattered more than anything. Her numbers had stayed steady through the night. Her breathing was easier. Her color looked a little better. Those small signs should have been the only things that mattered. But my phone kept lighting up in the drawer, and each buzz felt like another hand tapping on a locked door. When Grace woke, she asked for water, and then asked if the TV people were gone. I told her yes. She looked relieved. Did Grandma get mad? She asked. I helped her take a small sip through the straw. Grandma has some grown-up feelings to deal with. Grace frowned. Because I said I wanted her. No, baby. Because sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable. She thought about that as if it were a school lesson she did not like. Then she leaned back and whispered, I do not want to be on TV anymore. You do not have to be, I said. Not unless you want to. That was the first promise I made to her that morning. The second one I made silently. I would not let anyone use her pain again. Not my family, not the news, not strangers who wanted a sad story to feel righteous about for a few minutes. After breakfast, Claire helped Grace sit up for a short while. Dr. Hart came in and said her recovery was moving in the right direction, but she still needed calm, careful monitoring and no emotional stress. I almost laughed when he said that. Emotional stress had walked into the room wearing pearls and carrying lilies the night before. When he left, I finally checked my messages. Aunt Susan had sent 3. Hannah, I just saw the news. I am so sorry. Your mother told us. She was managing a family fund for Grace. Please tell me the money reached you. I read the last line twice. Then I scrolled down. My cousin Rachel wrote that she and her husband had sent $500 to my mother in June after Marjorie told everyone Grace's surgery costs were breaking Hannah. My father's friend from church said their small group had collected $1,200. One of Derek's business contacts wrote an awkward message saying he had contributed because Marjorie had described it as urgent medical support for my granddaughter. My hands went numb around the phone. I had known relatives had sent something. I had heard pieces of it in passing, but every time I asked my mother, she said she was keeping records, waiting for the right time, making sure there would be no tax confusion. I had been too exhausted, too afraid, and too busy fighting with insurance to demand more. I opened my email and searched Grace's name. Nothing from my mother, no spreadsheet, no receipts, no list of donors. Then I searched Marjorie's old messages. Months of vague reassurance appeared one after another. We are collecting carefully. Do not worry about the family side. Derek knows people who can help. Let me handle this, so you can focus on Grace. At the time, those messages had felt like support. Now, they looked like a curtain. My phone rang. It was Maya. I stepped into the hallway, keeping Grace in sight through the window. I am not putting Grace back on camera, I said before she could speak. I would not ask you to, Maya answered. I called to check on both of you, and to warn you. People are asking about the family fund. My stomach tightened. You know about that? Only what viewers are saying publicly. A few people posted that they donated through your mother. I have not used any of it, and I will not report anything unless you decide to speak and can document it yourself. That mattered. Maya was not digging through private records or chasing rumors. She was waiting for proof. Proof I suddenly realized I might already have. I need time, I said. Take it, she replied. And Hannah, be careful. Once money enters the story, your family will panic harder. She was right. The first call from Derek came 6 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. Then my mother called. Then my father. Then Derek again. I listened to none of them until Grace fell asleep after her medication. Derek's voicemail was sharp and breathless. Do not answer questions about money. You do not understand how nonprofit events work, and you could create serious problems for everyone. Call me before you say anything stupid. My mother's voice was colder. Hannah, you are letting strangers turn you against your own family. That money was never stolen. It was being handled. Do not start throwing accusations because you are emotional. My father's message was the shortest. Your mother says, this is getting out of control. Please talk to us privately. Privately. That word again. The place where my family liked to bury truth. I sat with my phone in my lap and looked at Grace. She was sleeping with one hand open on the blanket, the IV taped carefully against her skin. People had sent money because they thought it would help her. They had pictured hospital bills, medicine, recovery, maybe a few nights of rest for a mother who had not slept. Had any of that money touched her care? I already knew the answer. I just did not know where it had gone. The answer came from Aunt Susan. She forwarded me the original email my mother had sent months earlier. I had never seen it before. The subject line made my stomach turn. For Grace, family steps up when it matters. In the email, Marjorie wrote about Grace's condition in soft, tragic language. She wrote that I was too proud to ask. She wrote that the family had a duty to protect one of its youngest members. At the bottom, she listed her own payment information and said she would gather contributions before sending one organized payment toward Grace's medical expenses. Then Aunt Susan sent one more screenshot. It was her payment confirmation. Memo? Grace Medical Support? I covered my mouth with my hand. The room seemed to shrink around me. My mother had not simply failed to help. She had used my daughter's illness to collect money, then let me sit beside Grace's bed believing I had no support. I searched Derek's name next. Buried in a public article about the Children's Hope Gala was a donor list published 2 weeks earlier. Derek Reed, Gold Table sponsor. The amount was not listed there, but the timing made my skin crawl. My mother had been collecting money for Grace during the same months Derek was building his image around sick children. I did not have enough proof yet to accuse him of using the money, but I had enough to know something was wrong. Claire came in and found me staring at the screen. Hannah? She asked. I looked up. My mother collected money for Grace. Claire's face tightened. And did she give it to you? No. She was quiet for a moment. Then you need records. Not arguments. Records. That simple sentence steadied me. Records. Not rage. Not shouting in a hallway. Not another family fight where my mother could call me dramatic and Derek could call me confused. Records. So I began. I made a folder in my email. I saved Aunt Susan's message. I texted each person who had contacted me and asked one careful question. Did you send money to my mother for Grace's medical expenses? And if so, do you have a receipt or screenshot? I did not accuse Marjorie. I did not mention Derek. I did not post online. I only collected what people were willing to send. By late afternoon, I had 11 confirmations. By evening, I had 19. The total made me sit down. It was not enough to pay for everything, not even close, but it was enough to cover medication, follow-up visits, and the mountain of smaller costs that had been crushing me for months. More than that, it was proof that people had tried to help Grace, and my mother had stood between that help and my child. At 7, my phone rang again. This time, my mother left a message that sounded less angry and more afraid. "Hannah, I know people are contacting you. You need to stop asking questions before you misunderstand something you cannot fix." I played it twice. Then an email arrived from a woman named Patricia Lane, someone I only vaguely remembered from my parents' church. She wrote that she had donated through Marjorie after the fundraiser announcement. She also attached a screenshot. The memo line did not say Grace Medical Support. It said, "Children's Hope Gala Table, in honor of Grace Reed." I stared at those words until my eyes burned. In honor of Grace. My daughter had been lying in a hospital bed, asking why her grandmother would not come. And somewhere across town, her name had been used to buy a seat under the lights. For a long time, I could only stare at Patricia Lane's screenshot. Children's Hope Gala Table, in honor of Grace Reed. The words felt clean and polished, the kind of phrase people printed on programs and read under soft lights. But in that hospital room, beside my daughter's bed, they looked obscene. Grace had not been honored. She had been used. I did not wake her. She was sleeping with one cheek pressed into her pillow, her rabbit tucked beneath her arm. The nurses had finally gotten her pain under control, and her breathing had settled into a quiet rhythm. I sat there with my phone in both hands and felt the old instinct rise in me. Call my mother. Demand an explanation. Cry. Shout. Give her a chance to twist the room before I had even understood the truth. Then I remembered what Claire had said. Records. Not arguments. So I took a breath and saved the screenshot into the folder. I added Patricia's email, Aunt Susan's payment confirmation, the old fundraiser message from my mother, and every donation receipt that had come in so far. By then, the total was more than I could ignore. It was money people had given because they believed a sick child needed help. It was money I had never received. I did not know yet whether every dollar had gone to Derek's gala table, but I knew enough to stop calling it a misunderstanding. At 8 that night, my mother called again. This time I answered, but I did not speak first. "Hannah," she said, too calmly, "you need to stop collecting screenshots from people. You are creating confusion. I'm creating a record." Her silence lasted only a second, but I heard the shift. "You are grieving. You are exhausted. You are letting strangers fill your head with ugly ideas. I have Aunt Susan's email. I have Patricia Lane's screenshot. I have the fundraiser message you sent using Grace's name. That money was always meant to support the family effort. The family effort was my daughter's medical care. It is not that simple. It is exactly that simple." Her voice sharpened. "Derek's table brought attention to sick children. It was a strategic donation. Grace's name being attached to it was a way to honor her struggle." I looked at Grace sleeping under the thin hospital blanket. "You honored her by ignoring her after surgery." My mother inhaled hard. "You are being cruel." That word almost made me laugh. Cruel. Not stealing a child's sympathy money. Not calling her a problem. Not showing up only after the news exposed you. Cruel was what I became when I stopped accepting it quietly. Derek came onto the line then. He must have been sitting beside her. "Do you have any idea how serious your accusations are?" "Yes," I said. "That is why I am keeping records." "You do not understand nonprofit language. You do not understand sponsorship structures. You could ruin reputations over a paperwork issue." "Then send me the paperwork." Neither of them answered. I let the silence sit between us. It felt stronger than any shouting. Finally, my mother said, "We can talk about this after Grace is home." "No. We can talk through an attorney." Derek scoffed. "You cannot afford an attorney." I looked at the folder on my phone, at all those names of people who had believed they were helping my child. Maybe not. but I can afford the truth. I ended the call before they could answer. My hands were shaking, but I did not regret it. The next morning, I asked the hospital social worker if there was someone I could speak with about suspected misuse of funds raised for medical expenses. Her name was Elena Patel, and she had the steady, practical manner of a person who had watched families fall apart in fluorescent rooms and still believed in doing things properly. She did not act shocked. She did not ask for gossip. She asked what records I had. I showed her the folder. She read quietly, page by page, message by message. When she reached the gala screenshot with Grace's name in the memo, her expression tightened. "I cannot give legal advice," she said, "but you should not handle this through family conversations. You should contact a lawyer, and if donations were collected under false pretenses, you may also need to report it." The word report landed heavily. It made everything feel bigger than a family betrayal. It was no longer just a mother choosing her son over her daughter. It was money, names, donors. A sick child used as a reason. Elena gave me 2 numbers. One was for a legal aid clinic that sometimes helped families with medical debt and fraud concerns. The other was for a patient advocacy group connected with the hospital. She also told me to stop speaking with Derek and Marjorie directly about the money. "Let them put things in writing," she said. So I did. I sent one message to the family group chat. "Please send a full accounting of every donation collected in Grace's name, including dates, amounts, donor names, and where the money was spent." Derek replied first. "Do not do this here." My mother replied next. "We will not be interrogated by you while you are emotional." Then my father finally wrote, "Marjorie, send her the records, if everything is in order." That message stayed on the screen like a crack in a wall. It was the first time I had ever seen my father challenge her in writing. My mother did not respond after that. By afternoon, Maya called. I stepped into the hallway while Grace watched cartoons on low volume. "I heard from 2 donors who say they contributed to a fund for Grace," Maya said. "I told them, I cannot report anything without documents and without your consent. But Hannah, this is becoming a second story." "I know. Do you want that?" I looked through the window at Grace. She was smiling faintly at something on the screen. It was the first almost normal expression I had seen on her face in days. "I want my daughter left out of it as much as possible," I said. "No new footage of her. No using her pain for drama. Then we focus on the records. On the public fundraiser language. On donor claims. On the gala sponsorship. We do not need to show Grace again." That was why I trusted Maya for Bren. For Bren. She understood the difference between exposing harm and feeding on it. "I am speaking to legal aid first," I said. "After that, I will decide." That evening, an attorney named Ben Alvarez called me from the clinic. I expected him to sound rushed, but he listened carefully. He asked when the money had been collected, who had solicited it, what language was used, and whether donors believed it was for medical expenses. I sent him the folder while we spoke. When he finished reading, he was quiet for a few seconds. "This is not something to resolve with a family apology," he said. "At minimum, donors may have been misled. Depending on amounts and intent, it could become a fraud matter." I closed my eyes. Part of me still wanted him to say it was messy but harmless. That would have been easier. Painful, but easier. Instead, the truth was growing teeth. "What should I do?" I asked. "Preserve everything. Do not delete messages. Do not threaten them. Do not post accusations online. I can help draft a formal demand for accounting. If they refuse, we escalate." After the call, I sat beside Grace and watched her sleep. I thought about the night of the gala, my brother under lights, my mother in pearls, both of them standing near a table bought in my daughter's name. I wondered whether either of them had thought of Grace when they heard applause. I wondered if my mother had felt even a flicker of shame. My phone buzzed just before 9. This time it was my father. I did not know about the gala memo. I read the message twice, then waited. Another message came. I should have asked more questions. It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was the first sentence from him that did not ask me to make things easier for everyone else. I typed back, "Yes, you should have." Then I put the phone down. The next morning, Maya's second report aired without Grace's face. It showed the original fundraiser email, donor screenshots with names blurred, and the gala memo that said, "In honor of Grace Reed." It ended with a simple line from Maya. Donors say they believed they were helping a child's medical recovery. Now they want to know where the money went. By noon, the hospital foundation issued a statement saying Derek Reed had been suspended from all donor-facing roles pending review. By 3, the district attorney's office confirmed they had received complaints and were reviewing the matter. At 4:17, my mother finally sent me a message. "Look what you have done to this family." I looked at Grace, alive and resting, then at the folder full of records my mother never thought I would collect. For the first time, her accusation did not reach me, because I had not done this to our family. I had only opened the door and let the truth walk in. By the time the district attorney's office confirmed they were reviewing complaints, my phone felt less like a phone and more like a live wire. Every few minutes, another message appeared. Some were from donors asking what they should do next. Some were from relatives apologizing for not checking with me sooner. Some were from people I did not know, telling me they had watched the report and were praying for Grace. I answered almost none of them. Grace had started asking for toast instead of only crackers, and that mattered more than the entire city talking about my family. Dr. Hart said her numbers looked better each morning. Claire helped her take a few careful steps beside the bed, one hand on the IV pole, the other gripping mine. Grace moved slowly, but she smiled when she reached the door and looked back at the bed as if she had climbed a mountain. "You did it," I told her. She breathed out, tired but proud. I went all the way to the door. That was the victory I wanted to live inside. Not Derek's suspension, not my mother's panic, not the comments online, just my daughter standing on her own feet after I had spent days fearing I might lose her. But the outside world would not stay outside. That afternoon, Ben Alvarez called to tell me more donors had contacted his office. He had sent a formal demand for accounting to my mother and Derek, asking for records of every dollar collected in Grace's name. He told me to expect anger. "They may try to pressure you into calling this a misunderstanding," he said. "They already are. Do not speak to them alone. Do not agree to any private meeting. If they want to explain, they can do it in writing." After the call, I checked the family group chat. There were no records from my mother. No apology, no explanation. Only one message from Derek. "You have 48 hours to stop this before you ruin lives you cannot rebuild." I read it twice, then forwarded it to Ben. A few minutes later, my father texted me privately, "Do not answer your brother." I stared at that message for a long time. Arthur Reed had spent my entire life standing near the fire and pretending he could not feel the heat. He had watched my mother make choices, watched Derek benefit from them, watched me shrink around them, and called his silence peace. Now, for the first time, he sounded afraid of the machine he had helped build. "Did you know about the money?" I asked him. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "No," he finally wrote. "Not all of it. It was not enough, but it was something." "What did you know?" He did not answer for nearly an hour. When he did, the message was longer than anything he had sent me in years. "I knew your mother collected some donations. She told me she was waiting until the final bills came in. I knew Derek's gala table was expensive, but she said his company covered most of it. I did not ask to see records. That is on me." I sat in the visitor chair and let the words settle. He was still protecting himself, but there was a crack in it now. Not innocence, not full confession. A crack. Grace looked up from her cartoon. "Is Grandpa coming?" I locked the phone. Not today. Is he mad too? I sat beside her. A lot of grown-ups are upset right now, but that is not your job to fix. She nodded slowly. Because I'm the kid. Despite everything, I smiled. Exactly. You are the kid. That evening, the Hospital Foundation released a fuller statement. Derek Reed had been removed from the Gala Review Committee. All donations connected to the Children's Hope Gala table in Grace's name would be audited. The foundation also said it had no knowledge that funds intended for a child's medical expenses may have been redirected. Maya did not add drama to the report. She did not need to. The facts were clean enough to cut. Donors believed they were helping Grace. Marjorie collected the money. A gala table had been purchased in Grace's name. Hannah Reed said she never received the funds. Legal review was underway. The next morning, Derek's company issued its own statement. It was short, cold, and carefully written. Derek would be taking a temporary leave from public-facing duties while the matter was reviewed. I knew what that meant. Sponsors were pulling away. Clients were asking questions. People who had clapped for him under warm lights were now calculating how quickly they could distance themselves. My mother called 11 times before lunch. I did not answer. Then Aunt Susan sent me a voice message. Her voice shook with anger. Hannah, your mother called me and said you are confused from stress. She asked me to tell people I never intended the money strictly for Grace's bills. That is a lie. I sent it for Grace. I wrote that in the memo. I am so sorry. I played it once, saved it, and forwarded it to Ben. By late afternoon, the story had moved beyond embarrassment. Donors began filing formal complaints. The church group asked Marjorie to step down from its charity committee while they reviewed what had happened. One of Derek's sponsors publicly withdrew from the Gala partnership. The Hospital Foundation announced a temporary freeze on Derek's donor recognition page. My family had always cared about image. Now image had become the thing they could not control. At 5 that evening, my mother came to the hospital again. This time she came alone. Claire stopped her at the nurse's station before she reached Grace's room. I saw them through the doorway. My mother looked smaller without Derek beside her, but not softer. Her hair was perfect. Her purse matched her shoes. She had dressed for dignity, not apology. Claire came to ask if I wanted visitors. No, I said. Marjorie heard me. Her face tightened. Hannah, I am your mother. I stepped into the hallway and closed Grace's door behind me. Then act like one. Her mouth trembled, but her eyes stayed hard. You do not understand what you are doing. People are calling me a thief. Did you take money meant for Grace? I managed money that came through me. Did you give it to the hospital? She looked away. That was the answer. I felt the hallway narrow around us. For months, I had wondered if I was being unfair. Too suspicious, too tired, too emotional. But there it was, in her refusal to meet my eyes. You used her name, I said. My mother's voice dropped. Derek needed that table. It opened doors. Those doors could have helped all of us later. All of us, I repeated. Grace was recovering without the medicine fund people thought they were giving her. I was choosing which bills to delay, and you were buying Derek doors. Her face flushed. Do not make it sound so ugly. It is ugly. For the first time, she looked afraid. Not sorry. Afraid. If this becomes criminal, it will destroy me, she whispered. I thought about Grace asking if being sick had made Grandma mad. I thought about the empty chair. I thought about my mother's message. She lived. Stop making her our problem. No, I said. What destroys you is not the truth coming out. It is what you did before anyone knew. She reached for my arm, but I stepped back. Hannah, please. Tell them you misunderstood. Tell them I was going to repay it. Were you? She began to cry then. Quietly at first, then with the practiced sadness I had seen her use when she wanted a room to bend toward her. Years ago, It might have worked. I might have comforted her. I might have apologized for making her feel bad about hurting me. Not this time. I am not speaking to reporters about the money again until my attorney tells me to, I said. And I am not lying for you. Her tears stopped almost instantly. You have changed, she said. I looked through the small window in Grace's door. My daughter was asleep, one hand resting near her rabbit, her face peaceful for the first time all day. Yes, I said. I finally had to. Security escorted my mother out a few minutes later after she refused to leave the nurse's station. I did not watch her go. I went back into Grace's room, sat beside her bed, and held her hand. That night, she woke just long enough to whisper, "Is everything okay?" I brushed my thumb over her fingers. "Not yet, baby." She blinked at me, sleepy and trusting. "But we are safe?" she asked. I looked at the closed door, the quiet room, the empty chair that no longer felt like a wound, and the folder of records that had finally made my family's lies speak for themselves. "Yes," I said. "We are safe." The next morning, Grace asked for pancakes. It was such a small thing that I almost cried. For days, every victory had been measured in numbers on a monitor, ounces of water, minutes of sleep, and how long she could stay awake without pain pulling her back under. Pancakes sounded ordinary. Ordinary felt like a miracle. Claire laughed when I told her. "That is the best medical update I have heard all morning." Grace smiled weakly from the bed. "With syrup." "Then we will see what we can do," Claire said. For 15 minutes, the hospital room felt almost normal. Grace watched cartoons with the volume low. I brushed her hair gently, because she hated waking up with tangles. A volunteer from the children's floor brought her a small coloring book. Grace chose a blue crayon and began filling in a picture of a house with a crooked roof. Her hand shook a little, but she kept going. I wanted to stay inside that quiet forever. Then Ben Alvarez called. I stepped into the hallway but kept Grace in sight through the glass. Ben's voice was calm, but there was weight behind every word. "Hannah, the demand for accounting expired this morning," your mother's attorney responded. My stomach tightened. "She has an attorney now?" "Yes." The response claims all donations were given voluntarily to a family support effort, and that spending decisions were left to Marjorie's discretion. I looked through the window at Grace, coloring slowly under a hospital blanket. So she is saying the money was hers to use. "She is trying to," Ben said, "but the donor messages and memo lines are a problem for her. Most of them clearly mention Grace's medical expenses. Also, the gala memo using Grace's name creates a direct link they cannot easily explain away." I closed my eyes. What happens now? The district attorney's office has opened a preliminary inquiry. That does not mean charges yet. It means they are asking questions. I also recommend we file a civil claim to recover the funds for Grace's care. Recover the funds. The phrase sounded practical, almost small. But to me, it meant medicine. Follow-up appointments, gas to the hospital, time off work. It meant the money people had sent with kindness might finally reach the child they meant to help. "Do it," I said. After the call, I stood in the hallway for a moment. Before going back in, I had expected to feel satisfaction. Instead, I felt tired. Not regretful, just tired in a way that seemed to reach back through my whole life. Grace looked up from her coloring book. "Is something wrong?" "No, baby. Just grown-up paperwork." She made a face. "Paperwork is boring." "It really is." She returned to coloring, and I sat beside her, grateful for the simplicity of that answer. By noon, the news had changed again. Maya's station reported that the district attorney's office had begun reviewing complaints connected to donations raised in a child's name. They did not show Grace's face this time. They used documents with names blurred, a shot of the gala banner, and a short clip of Derek's old speech. "No child should ever feel alone after surgery." That sentence had followed him everywhere. People were using it under articles, in comments, in messages to the hospital foundation. Derek had built his public image on compassion, and now the public was holding him to the words he had said under lights. At 2, Derek's company announced he was taking an extended leave. The statement said it was his decision. No one believed that. At 3, the Children's Hope Gala Committee removed his name from its donor page. By 4, the church where my mother had served on the charity board released a note saying Marjorie Reed had stepped down while the matter was being reviewed. I learned all of it through messages other people sent me. I did not search for it. I did not need to watch them fall in real time. The sound of falling had filled my childhood enough. Aunt Susan called in the afternoon. This time I answered. "I am sorry," she said before I could speak. Her voice was rough, as if she had been crying. "I should have sent the money directly to you. I believed your mother when she said you were too proud to accept help." I looked down at my lap. Pride had nothing to do with it. I had been drowning too quietly for anyone to hear. "You did not steal from Grace," I said. "You tried to help her." "I still should have checked." "Maybe," I said softly. "But she is the one who lied." There was a silence between us, not empty, just sad. Then Aunt Susan said, "Some of us want to send help directly now, only if you are comfortable." The old me would have said no. The old me would have worried about looking needy, about owing people, about my mother calling me dramatic. But the old me had spent too many nights choosing which bill could wait. "If you want to help Grace," I said, "Ben can set up a proper account. Transparent. For medical expenses only." "That is all we wanted from the beginning," she said. When I hung up, I realized my hands were not shaking. That evening, Dr. Hart told me Grace might be able to go home in several days if her progress continued. Not home exactly, because our apartment needed a few adjustments for her recovery, and I still had to arrange follow-up care. But out of the hospital, out of the room where she had learned too much about adults who failed her. Grace heard the words and smiled so wide that for a second, I saw the little girl she had been before all the pain. "Can I bring my rabbit?" Dr. Hart smiled. "The rabbit is medically approved." She giggled, and the sound made my chest ache with relief. Later, after Claire dimmed the lights, my father came to the hospital. He did not try to enter the room. He waited at the nurse's station and asked if I would speak to him in the hallway. I almost said no. Then I saw him through the glass, older than I remembered, shoulders bent, hands empty. No flowers, no excuses ready in his palms. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. He looked at Grace through the window. "She looks better. She is getting stronger." He nodded. "Good." We stood in awkward silence. My father had never been good with hard conversations. He could explain insurance policies, weather patterns, and the best route to avoid traffic. But feelings made him look lost. Finally, he said, "Your mother is saying you are trying to destroy Derek." "I am trying to recover money meant for my daughter." "I know." That surprised me. He rubbed both hands over his face. "I did not know all of it, Hannah. But I knew enough to ask questions." "I did not. I let your mother handle things because it was easier than fighting with her. I let Derek be Derek because it was easier than holding him accountable." His voice broke on the last word. I waited. I did not rescue him from the discomfort. That had never been my job, though I had acted like it was for years. "I failed you," he said, "and I failed Grace." The words landed quietly. They did not fix anything. They did not erase the empty chair, the messages, the money, or the years of being told to understand. But they were the first honest words he had given me. "What are you going to do about it?" I asked. He looked at me, startled. I continued, "I do not need a speech, Dad. I need to know whether you are still going to stand beside them while they lie." He swallowed. "I told the investigator I would cooperate." My breath caught. "With what?" "With bank records I have access to, joint accounts, transfers I did not question at the time." For the first time that day, the hallway seemed completely still. My father looked ashamed, but he did not look away. I should have done it sooner. Yes, I said. You should have. I know. I wanted to feel warmth toward him. I wanted that moment to become a clean beginning, but real life is not that generous. Some truths come too late to be comforting. Still, they matter. You can see Grace when she is ready, I said. Not tonight. Not because you feel guilty. When she is ready. He nodded. I understand. I was not sure he did, but at least he did not argue. After he left, I went back into the room. Grace was awake, watching me with sleepy eyes. Was that Grandpa? Yes. Is he sad? I think so. She thought about it. Did he bring flowers? No. Good, she whispered. I'm tired of flowers. I smiled and tucked the blanket around her. Me too. That night, while Grace slept, I checked my phone one last time. There were angry messages from Derek, unread voicemails from my mother, and one email from Ben confirming that my father had contacted the investigator. For the first time, the consequences were no longer just public shame. The records were moving through the right hands. The people who had built their lives on appearances were facing something appearances could not fix. I turned the phone off and held Grace's hand in the quiet. My family had spent years teaching me that keeping peace meant protecting their image. But peace built on lies is not peace. It is a cage with nicer curtains. And that night, for the first time, I felt the lock begin to break. Grace was released from the hospital 4 days later. She was still weak, and every step had to be slow. But when Claire rolled her toward the exit in a wheelchair, Grace held her rabbit in her lap like a tiny queen leaving a battlefield. The nurses clapped softly as we passed. Dr. Hart bent down and told her to follow every instruction, even the boring ones. Grace promised him she would, then whispered to me that boring instructions were better than scary ones. We did not go back to my old apartment right away. The patient advocate helped arrange a small recovery suite near the hospital for 2 weeks, funded through the proper medical account Ben had set up. Every dollar was recorded. Every donor received a receipt. No one had to trust a whispered promise from my mother again. The first night there, Grace fell asleep before sunset. I sat beside her bed with a cup of tea going cold in my hands and listened to the quiet. No monitors. No footsteps in the hallway. No visitor chair staring at me like an accusation. Just my daughter breathing safely in a room where no one could walk in and perform love for witnesses. The consequences for my family kept moving without me pushing them. Ben told me the civil claim had been filed. The district attorney's office had requested records from several donors. My father had provided bank statements showing transfers from Marjorie's account around the time Derek's gala table was purchased. Derek's company extended his leave. My mother's church removed her from every charity committee pending review. I thought I would feel victory. Instead, I felt space. Wide, unfamiliar space. For years, my family's needs had filled every empty corner of my life. Their image, their feelings, their excuses, their version of events. Now, for the first time, there was room for Grace and me to heal without asking permission. That peace lasted until Derek came to the suite. He arrived with my mother just after lunch on the 3rd day. The building receptionist called first, saying 2 visitors were asking for me. I told her they were not allowed upstairs. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. Derek's name appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it, but Grace was asleep, and I did not want him showing up again and again. I stepped into the small kitchenette and answered. "We are downstairs," he said. His voice sounded rough, stripped of the smooth confidence he used at galas. "We need 10 minutes. No. Hannah, please. This is serious." It was serious when Grace was in the hospital. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My company is cutting ties with me if this does not get contained. The foundation is considering a permanent ban. Mom could be charged. Do you understand what that means? Yes. We need you to make a statement, not a lie. Just say things got emotional. Say the family is handling it privately. Say you do not want this to go any further. I looked toward the room where Grace was sleeping. Her medication schedule was taped to the wall. Her follow-up appointments were stacked beside the sink. Her coloring book lay open on the table. A blue house with a crooked roof half finished. You still think this is about statements, I said. It is about survival. No, Derek. It is about consequences. His breath came hard through the phone. I know I messed up with the text. I should have come. I should have called. Fine, I admit that. But you are letting this become something bigger than it had to be. It was always bigger. You just did not care until other people saw it. My mother's voice came through then, farther from the phone but sharp enough to cut. Tell her family protects family. I closed my eyes. There it was. The sentence she had used my entire life whenever she wanted my silence. Put her on, I said. A second later, Marjorie spoke. Hannah, I am begging you. Whatever you think I did, I am still your mother. You collected money in Grace's name. I was going to make it right. When? She did not answer. When she was in pain? When I was choosing which bill to delay? When she asked why you did not come? When Derek needed applause, you knew how to move money. When Grace needed medicine, suddenly everything was complicated. Her voice trembled. You want me destroyed? No. I wanted you to be my mother. There is a difference. For the first time, she had no quick answer. I could hear Derek breathing near the phone. I could picture them in the lobby, dressed carefully, trying to look respectable in case anyone recognized them. Then my mother said softer, If charges are filed, I may never recover from this. I looked at my daughter through the doorway. She stirred in her sleep and pulled the rabbit closer. Grace may never fully forget what you made her feel, I said. You are worried about recovering your name. I am worried about helping my child recover her sense of worth. Derek took the phone back. What do you want from us? That question should have come years earlier. It should have come when Daniel died and I was alone with a grieving 3-year-old. It should have come when Grace got sick. It should have come when I sent that photo and begged them to visit. I want the accounting, I said. Every dollar, every donor, every transfer. I want the money returned to Grace's medical account. I want you both to stop contacting donors and telling them I am confused. I want you to stop using the word family as a leash. And if we do that, I will tell the truth. He gave a bitter laugh. That is not helping us. No, I said. It is helping Grace. My mother said something I could not hear. Derek lowered his voice. We are asking for one favor. I felt the old reflex move inside me. One favor. One more sacrifice. One more chance to prove I was not cruel, not bitter, not ungrateful, but that reflex no longer controlled my hand. You asked for one favor when Grace wanted you to come, I said. You said busy. I ended the call. That evening, Ben came by with paperwork for the medical account and the civil claim. He also brought news. Maya's station had requested one final interview, not with Grace, with me. They wanted to give me a chance to respond to the public pressure and explain what I wanted next. You do not have to do it, Ben said. Silence is also an option. I looked at Grace, who was awake now and coloring at the table. She had drawn 2 people outside the crooked blue house, one tall, one small. No grandparents, no uncle, just us. I am tired of silence being the only safe choice, I said. Ben nodded. Then we prepare. You do not attack. You do not speculate. You speak only to what you know. That night, after Grace fell asleep, I wrote down what I wanted to say. I crossed out every sentence that came from anger. I crossed out every sentence that sounded like I was asking people to hate my family for me. By midnight, only the truth remained. My daughter asked for her family after surgery, and they refused to come. People donated money believing it would help her medical care, and that money did not reach us. I am not trying to destroy anyone. I am trying to stop protecting choices that hurt my child. The next morning, before Maya arrived, Grace touched my hand. Are you going on TV again? Yes. Just me this time. Are you scared? A little. She thought about that, then pushed her rabbit into my lap. Hold him. He helps. I took the rabbit and felt tears rise behind my eyes, but I smiled. Thank you, baby. Maya arrived at 10 with only one camera operator. No bright crowd, no drama. Just a chair near the window, a small microphone, and enough quiet for me to hear my own heartbeat. Before the camera started, my phone lit up with one last message from my mother. If you do this, there is no going back. I looked at it for a long time. Then I turned the phone face down. She was right. There was no going back. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. Maya waited until I was ready. That was one thing I would always respect about her. She did not push the camera into my grief or ask me to perform pain so strangers would believe it was real. She sat across from me in that small recovery suite, hands folded over her notes, while Grace slept in the next room with her rabbit tucked under her chin. When the camera light came on, I felt my throat tighten. For a moment, I thought of every version of myself that had stayed quiet. The girl who smiled when Derek got praised for things she had done first. The young widow who accepted folded towels instead of comfort. The mother who believed that if she kept asking gently enough, her family might finally show up with love instead of excuses. Maya asked me what I wanted people to understand. I looked at the camera, then down at the rabbit in my lap. Grace had insisted I hold it because it helped with fear. She was right. It did. My daughter did not ask for money that night, I said. She did not ask for attention. She had just survived a dangerous surgery, and she wanted her grandmother and uncle to visit. That was all. My voice shook, but I kept going. I shared the messages because I was tired of pretending that cruelty becomes less cruel when it happens privately. People donated money believing it would help Grace's medical care. That money did not reach us. The legal process can decide the rest. But as her mother, I can say this clearly. I will not protect anyone's reputation at the cost of my child's heart. Maya let the silence breathe. She did not rush to fill it. Then she asked if I wanted revenge. The question should have been easy, but it was not. A part of me had wanted my family to feel one fraction of what Grace had felt when she looked at the empty chair. A part of me wanted Derek to stand in a silent room with no one applauding him. A part of me wanted my mother to know what it felt like to beg and be dismissed. But that was not the whole truth. I want accountability, I said. Revenge would mean building my life around their punishment. I do not want that. I want the money returned. I want the people who donated to know the truth. I want Grace to grow up knowing that love does not require her to stay silent when someone hurts her. That was the sentence that aired that night. Not my tears, not the ugliest details, not a dramatic plea, just the truth. The response came faster than I expected. By the next morning, Ben called to tell me Derek's attorney had offered to return the full amount collected in Grace's name, plus additional funds to cover legal fees and documented medical expenses. It was not generosity. It was panic, dressed as settlement language. Ben told me not to celebrate yet, but for the first time, I heard relief in his voice. The district attorney's office continued its review. Marjorie was not arrested in some dramatic scene, and Derek was not dragged away from his office while cameras flashed. Real consequences did not look like movies. They looked like letters from lawyers, frozen committee rolls, donor complaints, interviews with investigators, and people who once returned your calls suddenly deciding they needed distance. Derek resigned from the hospital foundation before they could remove him permanently. His company announced he would no longer represent them in community partnerships. The sponsors who had smiled beside him at the gala quietly disappeared. That hurt him more than any shouting could have. Derek had always believed a good name could be purchased, polished, and displayed under the right lighting. Now his name had become something people avoided, saying too loudly. My mother stepped down from every charity position she had spent years using as proof of her goodness. The church group issued a formal apology to donors who had believed their money was going directly to Grace's care. Marjorie hated that most of all. Not the legal review, not the repayment. The apology. It meant other people were allowed to name what she had done. She sent me one message after the settlement agreement was drafted. "You have taken everything from me." I read it while Grace was napping. My first instinct was to answer, to explain, to defend, to remind her that I had not written her message for her. I had not made Derek stay away. I had not taken money collected in a child's name, but I had spent too many years trying to make my mother understand what she had chosen not to see. So I wrote only one sentence. "No, Mom. I stopped giving you my silence." Then I blocked her number for a while. Not forever, maybe, but long enough to heal without her voice finding every bruise. My father came to see Grace 2 weeks later, with my permission and hers. He did not bring flowers. He brought a small puzzle book and a soft blanket with cartoon stars on it. He stood awkwardly near the door until Grace waved him closer. "Are you really sorry?" she asked him. I almost stepped in, but I stopped myself. It was her question. Arthur sat carefully in the chair beside her. The chair was no longer empty, but I watched it closely all the same. "Yes," he said. "I am sorry I did not come when you wanted us." Grace studied him. "Mommy says sorry means you do better." His eyes filled. "Your mommy is right." That was the beginning of whatever he and I might have later. Not forgiveness, not trust, a beginning. I had learned not to confuse those things. 3 months passed before Grace returned to school part-time. Her hair had grown a little thicker. Her color came back slowly. She still tired easily, but she laughed more often. Some nights she had bad dreams about hospitals, and I would sit beside her until she fell asleep again. Healing was not a straight road. It was a hallway with lights that flickered, doors that opened slowly, and days when courage looked like getting out of bed. The recovered funds went into a medical account managed through Ben's office. Every donor received a letter, a receipt, and my thanks. Some people wrote back with apologies, some sent cards for Grace. Aunt Susan visited once, cried too much, and promised never again to trust family pride over direct kindness. I used part of the settlement to start something small at first. We called it the Grace Room Fund. It helped parents who had to stay beside hospitalized children without support. Meal cards, parking passes, a clean sweatshirt after an overnight stay, a phone charger, a ride home. Small things, maybe, but I knew how large small things become when you are alone. The first time we delivered care bags to the pediatric floor, Grace came with me. She was still moving slowly, but she insisted on carrying the bag with the stuffed animals. Claire met us by the nurse's station and hugged me so carefully it made me laugh. Grace handed a small rabbit to a little boy, waiting for tests. Then she slipped her hand into mine. "Mommy," she whispered, "is this because Grandma did not come?" I looked down at her. "Partly," she thought about that. "And because other kids need someone to come?" "Yes," I said. "That part matters more." On our way out, we passed the recovery room, where everything had changed. A different child was there now. A different mother sat in the chair beside the bed, holding a cup of coffee with both hands like it was keeping her upright. For a moment, I saw myself in her. Not because our stories were the same, but because fear has a language every parent understands. I left one of our care bags with Claire and asked her to give it to the mother when the time felt right. That evening, Grace asked if I could carry her on my back down the hallway of our apartment building. She was too big for it now, and I told her so. She gave me the look Daniel used to give when he knew I was about to give in. So, I crouched down. She climbed onto my back, light and warm. her arms wrapping around my neck. In the hallway mirror, I saw us together, my daughter peeking over my right shoulder, smiling for the first time without that shadow of waiting in her eyes. My phone buzzed once on the table. A message from an unknown number. "Can we see Grace someday?" I knew it was my mother. New number. Same need. Same belief that wanting access was the same as earning it. I looked at Grace in the mirror. "Who is it?" she asked. "No one we need tonight." She rested her cheek against my shoulder. Good. I deleted the message. Maybe someday there would be a conversation. Maybe there would not. But that night, my answer was simple. My daughter did not need a grandmother who arrived only after consequences. She needed peace. She needed safety. She needed a mother who no longer mistook blood for permission to hurt us. For most of my life, I thought family meant the people you had to forgive because they shared your name. Now I know better. Family is who shows up when showing up costs something. Family is who tells the truth gently, protects you without performing it, and never makes a child feel like a problem for needing love. Grace tightened her arms around my neck and laughed as I carried her down the hall. And for the first time in years, I did not feel like I had lost my family. I felt like I had finally found my way home.